Step in my dojo, you step in my dojo, you step in my.
So today on the weekly download, I'm joined by Nick, one of our fellow dojo members. He's been hanging out here at the dojo for a little bit. It's good times. And today we're going to talk about chopping up breakbeats. And this is a subject near and dear to my heart. I mean, I started out as a breaks producer in a breakdance crew, making music for breakdancing. And I sampled quite a few breaks over the years, and there's a lot of different things that you can do with them that are cool, and a lot of different things that are maybe not so obvious, or at least it would seem from our late night study session last night that a lot of it's really not obvious. Basically, every time before the weekly download, like I usually have a pretty good idea of how I'm gonna do it, but then I'll go and I'll watch all the YouTube tutorials and check all the paid tutorial sites and see if there's anything that I'm missing. And man, the internet's kind of hurting for tutorials about chopping up breakbeats. It's kind of hurting. And they're really missing a lot of pretty important considerations. It was more just like, hey, here's how the slice to MIDI feature works, or these are some things you can do with breakbeats, and less really about the underlying aesthetics of like why you would be sampling a breakbeat in the first place, and what you're going for when you're sampling a breakbeat. So a breakbeat, for those of you who don't know, the term break is actually a compositional term, right? And the term breakbeat comes from in the 70s when hip hop was first created. There weren't any hip hop records out there. There were hip hop DJs who would play funk and disco and like rare groove records. And there were rappers who would rap over top, but no one had actually made a rap record. So how do you make a hip hop set without any hip hop records to play? Well, what the DJs would do is they would notice that when they were playing these like funk and soul records and stuff, they would be looking out at the dance floor and really trying to make those people move as much as they could and trying to make them have as much fun as they possibly could. And the DJs noticed that people didn't dance as much in the sections of the song where there was singing, and people didn't dance as much in the sections of the song where there was a lot of melody. But in the section of the song known as the break, where the band would take a break and give the drummer some space, and then the drummer would just lay down a really tight dance beat, just basically by itself, maybe with someone playing tambourine over top, or some bongos over top, or maybe even a little like hey ho kind of group chant in the background. But there wasn't bass, there wasn't there wasn't melody, there wasn't singing. It was pretty much just the drums. Okay, so DJs noticed that this area of the song would make people dance more, so they would get 2 copies of the record and they would play the break and loop it. So they would play like, maybe the break was like 4 bars or 8 bars. They would play it, and while it was playing out on one record, they would use their headphones to back cue the record on the second turntable, and as the break was ending on the first record, they would play the break on the second record. And then that meant that they could just kind of extend that break beat indefinitely by looping it and by scratching and stuff. And there's a lot of really innovative techniques where people would put stickers on the record and make it so that you could drop the needle and then slide it forwards, and the sticker would ensure that the needle lands at the exact cue point. Because on a CDJ you can just hit cue points, right? You can just set cue points, but you can't do that on a vinyl record. So people had a lot of kind of interesting techniques, and DJing used to be a lot more about doing these kind of tricks and scratching and looping break beats and stuff. And that's why the DMC, or disco mixing competition, was such a big deal. And if you look up DMC, you can see that the disco mixing competition is still alive and well, and there are DJs all over the world who will spend hours and hours and hours making these really complicated battle routines, where, you know, they'll be like spinning around and scratching records under their arms and, you know, doing all these crazy tricks and juggles and blah, 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 blah. So that's a very interesting world for you to check out. You could also check out, you know, Baz Luhrmann's interesting Netflix show, the first season of which was pretty much flawless until Jaden Smith got involved in the second season, but we're not going to talk about Jaden Smith right now. But The Get Down is a very interesting fictional television show that is set in the era of the birth of hip hop. And you can kind of learn a little bit about the culture and a little bit about, you know, about where that aesthetic sound kind of comes from, right? So fast forward to the late 70s and you get a record called... Most of the heavy lifting in the track is done by this one drum kit. A lot of people will just continuously ignore drum sound design for, like, you know, huge portions of their career, and they'll wonder why their music isn't like hitting people right, you know? And it's like, we don't want to hear you play someone else's beat, you know? We want to hear your beat. You know, once you know how to make them, and you understand that it's easy, because it is easy once you do the chorus, then your tracks are going to be so much more expressive, and they're going to have a real authentic texture that is undeniably yours, where you can speak and express yourself through the drums. Fast forward to the late 70s and you get a record called Rapper's Delight comes out. That I'm sure you all know this record. It's a fantastic piece of music. And then basically people started being a lot more interested in, you know, samplers and stuff, and samplers started coming out. And there's this whole aesthetic born of, you know, the Wild West of sampling, because before samplers had come out, nobody was really considering the legality of sampling. Like, no one really thought about it. They were just like, oh, it's a sampler, you sample things with it, like, I'll just do that. And you know, a lot of these records, there was kind of like a what's known as the golden era in hip-hop music, that basically was from the invention of early samplers like the SP1200, the Akai S950, and the MPC series of samplers. Those samplers kind of birthed a movement in hip-hop, and before the copyright trolls and before a lot of the kind of legality, you know, before people were suing the pants off of each other, it was kind of the Wild West of sampling. And there's a lot of really, really interesting music that came out of that. You know, think about like Vanilla Ice sampling Queen's Under Pressure, you know, like, who would do that now? Who would risk being sued so much now, you know? But, you know, De La Soul, a lot of the early NWA records were very sample heavy, Cypress Hill, you know, a lot of the Wu-Tang Clan, a lot of this stuff was born out of this sampling tradition, sampling breakbeats. And you still see a lot of artists, you know, like if who can afford the copyright, you know, to afford to license these samples, you know, like Drake and Jay-Z and a lot of these other big artists today are still, you know, working with samples, but they're going out and they're licensing these samples and paying money to the original artists, or at least their copyright holders. Yeah, don't forget about PM Dawn too. Excellent musicians. And now we're gonna chop up some of these breaks. So if you check out here, if you go to in the same folder, if you go to current project where the molded breaks are, there's also this imported, where you can see all of the breaks here. And so if you're not using Ableton, you just browse into that folder, and you could find, if you browse into that folder, you could find those samples. Like if you're using Machine or you're using FL Studio, you'll still be able to have access to all of these samples. So okay, let's use this Shack Up break. That's a great break. Okay, so first thing I want to do is I want to warp it, and I don't want to do too much warping to this, because a big part of sampling breaks is the fact that there's a natural groove that comes from a real drummer, and that's part of what makes the break sound really good. So you might want to tidy up like the downbeats, especially the first kick of each bar. You might want to tidy it up, but the rest of it you kind of want to leave it a little bit loose. You know, that's part of what makes it sound good, is that there's a little bit of looseness to it. It's a little bit off the grid. So right away I can tell that this is, you know, that's like almost a 30-second note off. That's not so great. So I'm going to take that one and just nudge that one over. And then later it's pulled everything forwards farther than I'd like. So I'm going to take this snare and put that on. And then let's check this one. Yeah, that could probably come on too. But you may remember from the episode that we did on fills that if we were to take this and put it into a drum rack, that if I drag it in, it's going to, and I put it on warp, it's going to retain my warping. Like you can see here, if I zoom in, this is the new warped break. So when I press and hold one of these MIDI notes, that's gonna give me that nice new warped version of the drum break, and it's going to make sure everything is on. Oh, look at here. I can see this end is a little bit of creep at the end. It's creeping forwards a little more than I'd like, so I'll just tidy that up. But yeah, so the first thing to do is to kind of go in and make sure that the major hits of the beat are kind of more or less accurate. But you can leave a little bit of that push and pull. There's not, you know, don't overdo it. But yeah, so if I bring that in, then I zoom in, yeah, that's a little bit better. That's a little bit better. So now what a lot of people do when they're chopping up a break beat, what a lot of people will do is, so now what a lot of people do when they're chopping up a break beat, what a lot of people will do is they'll take the break beat, they'll right click, and they'll go slice to new MIDI track. Now this is a very cool feature. And what this does, you can say one slice per transient, and then you could go built in, and this will chop it to a drum rack, and you get something that looks like this, where you can see all of the slices here going up the drum rack. Right? And that's pretty cool. But there are some things that I don't like about this. Okay. First of all, sometimes the transients aren't really that accurate, and it'll like, if you go in here, there might be like this one here, for example, that's kind of annoying. Or sometimes there'll be double ones, depending on the break, there'll be like maybe one too many transients. Or you can see here that these transients aren't really coming at a constant rate. There's times when the drummer is playing 16th notes, and there's times when the drummer is playing 8th notes. And that means that when you cut it up, you can't just go 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and go up the keys, because you know, you'd have to memorize what the actual pattern of the break it is. So yeah. It's hard to remember this, to play fast in one spot and to play slow in one spot. That can be kind of awkward to remember. And then what a lot of people end up doing is they'll kind of take the break and they'll edit it up in here, and it's just kind of doesn't sound that you know, it sounds awkward, and you have to remember all these little runs of fast and slow, and it's like hard to memorize. So other ways you can chop a break: you can take the break and put it into the Ableton Simpler, okay? And this is really cool. So there's a slice mode right in the Ableton Simpler. If I go into the slice mode, the push, usefully goes into this slice mode, and it goes out of the kind of limited scale chromatic mode that you're probably used to the push operating in. And you can see that it's, oops, so I'm gonna do that. You can see here that we have this nicer editor. You can adjust the sensitivity and it will, maybe skip some of the smaller transients. And you can also change the slicing in real time. You could say slice by beat and then say, every quarter note. Right, so that's something that people like to do. A lot of people do a region chop too, and you can turn up the number of regions. Let's say 16 regions. And that's akin to more something that you would do on an MPC to make it playable. That region chop is very, very cool. But most people will slice by transient or by region or by manual. One of the advantages to using one simpler as opposed to many simplers in a drum rack is, let's say that you wanted to go into the device mode in the simpler. And let's say that you wanted to adjust the filter. I'll just put this on the SMP mode on the filter. The SMP mode is a mode modeled after an MPC. So if you're chopping breaks and you want that familiar MPC or breakbeat in an MPC sound that we've all known and loved for so long, you could put that on, and it has a very characteristic MPC style of drive. And giving it a little bit of drive really tends to kind of thicken up a breakbeat. It's really nice to saturate the whole breakbeat at once. So when I go in here, let's turn this up to 32 regions because I think they're coming a little quick for my tastes. But I'll do that. And then if you put it on to playback, if you put it on through mode, then when you hold it, it'll play through the other slices. I'll put it on gate. That is a much more playable way to deal with the breakbeats. And you can saturate them all together. Like if then I'll turn down the volume to compensate for the drive added by the saturator.